Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Sonia, and on this channel we talk about health, lifestyle trends and travel. And today we're doing a Zoom interview with Judy Howard-Barth. Thank you, Judy, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's very exciting. This is number 2. So we have a series of 2, session 1 or clip number 1 and clip number 2. So be sure to check the other one out. Judy has years of experience and knows what she's talking about, and it's great to learn new information, and that's why this channel is here, to help with health information or information so that we can be better at just being better, being good. So welcome.
Good.
Welcome, and just maybe to recap, you're a psychotherapist. So
I am,
in
yes.
your in the previous clip, which I will link, you actually discuss what that actually means. But we might just do a little refresh because someone may have just tuned in for the first time. So just
Absolutely.
yeah,
Okay. Okay, so a psychotherapist is essentially a talk therapist. So when you actually go see a psychotherapist, if you go see an adult psychotherapist, they will actually talk to you. They specialize in that. They're a little bit different from a psychologist. If you see someone like a child and adolescent psychotherapist, then perhaps we talk with children who are probably about 12 years and old. Obviously, we talk to everybody, but we primarily, that's probably the tools that we use. We talk to children who are in their teenage years or in their late teenage years. But if they're under the age of 12, then children don't tend to sort of think in abstract terms, so that talking can be a little bit problematic. So we actually do lots and lots of play with those children. So that's what a child and adolescent psychotherapist does. We're actually always seeking to work out what is beneath. So we will ask questions, we will go into the past, we're trying to find out what has maybe happened there, how something's been internalized, how a child has perceived what has happened or may have experienced what has happened, which is what we're going to be talking about today,
yeah,
and how what happened then, how that informs what is going on now and what's causing the distress then. Distress now. The other thing is many of us, myself included, we lean heavily on the area of neurobiology, and that is the understanding of the brain, how the brain works, and how when trauma, like we're talking about today, how that will impact on the developing brain and actually create some fairly serious issues as a child tries to grow up and develop into a happy, healthy human being. So yeah, so that's essentially what a psychotherapist
that,
does.
that's a lot of work.
Oh, that sounds like it, yes, I suppose. Yes.
So I guess the big question is, what is trauma? We're looking at the
Okay,
subject of trauma. Trauma in children is specific to you and what
yes.
you deal with. So what is the definition of trauma? And I guess, is it that one's experience is different to another person's? Like, is it perceived differently as well? So I guess two questions there.
Okay, all right. So two parts to it. So trauma is not some psychological, it can obviously impact you psychologically, but it isn't just some thought or something that happened. Trauma is actually brain injury. That's how we define trauma. It's something, when something happens, it actually overwhelms the brain's ability to cope. So it's not something that something bad's happened and you cope with. Trauma actually overwhelms your brain, and your brain will respond in different ways. It's physiological change, and it can be measured, and we can see it in brain imaging. Just the impact of the trauma on the brain. And there are different types of trauma, which I'll go into a little while later. One is called simple trauma, and the other one is called complex trauma. So to answer, Sonia, your
Yeah.
question about is trauma particular to a person, well, yes, of course, of
Mm.
course. People will respond in a whole heap of different ways, but there will be some commonalities because if you remember that trauma is an overwhelming event that overwhelms the brain, then our brains are similar in that they will respond in a
In the
similar
same
way.
way.
But sorry, go on.
So I was going to ask, can that event of trauma, can it be a singular episode, or can it be ongoing events that actually
Okay.
we consider
Okay.
trauma?
Yes.
Like, can it just be one thing, like a death, or ongoing, like, events like that could
Cool.
occur over and over and over?
So trauma overwhelms the brain. So even though someone died, that may be a time of deep grief, it may be a time of loss, but it may not be traumatic because it doesn't overwhelm the brain. That overwhelming part is dependent on a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
It can be the quality of the relationships around you, whether you've got good support networks, whether you have good modelling from the people around you, whether or not they themselves are coping and learning to adapt. It also can be dependent on previous trauma or experience. But to answer the question about, is it a single event? Yes, simple trauma can be a one-off event. Something like a bushfire can even be an assault. Something like an illness, a car accident, something that overwhelms your brain that happens once, maybe.
Yeah.
The other one, and simple trauma can be treated really successfully.
Yeah.
The other one is what we call complex trauma, and that's one of the ones that I'd like to talk a lot about today. Complex trauma is different. Complex trauma is multiple experiences of trauma. It's multifaceted.
Mm-hmm.
It's invasive, and it usually occurs within relationships. So because of that, we have a lot of other feelings. So one is the brain being overwhelmed by the trauma.
Yeah.
The other thing is the residual feelings of guilt and shame, strongly connected with complex trauma. And these go on to disintegrate feeling your sense of self-worth and your identity and trust and all those things that are necessary to grow up to be a happy, healthy human being. And domestic violence and childhood abuse are good examples of what complex trauma. And they are, of the two, like I said, simple trauma and complex trauma. Complex trauma is actually the harder of the two to work through and takes longer.
I can imagine, with all the feelings and all the associated
Absolutely.
assets.
Absolutely.
A lot more to do. I guess the reality is that those viewing today may have or have probably experienced trauma in their lives, and some have dealt with it well, and others may not have dealt with it so well, and it could actually be an issue for them right now. I guess, how does trauma manifest itself in relationships and people's ability to function and be able to cope? Like, you know, how does it display itself? Like, if we're a partner of a person or the mother of a child, what would we see?
Okay, so because trauma overwhelms the brain, the evidence of it is fairly obvious. And what that can mean is it'll be dependent on the individual. Whether people do well getting over trauma, like I said, I don't know if you can say they do well. I think they may have had factors in place that would have helped them and aided them getting and being able to resolve the trauma, and that is not through any fault of their own. That is just that was they had a good enough parenting or good enough factors in place, maybe a very supportive person, maybe a good police officer, maybe someone who was able to step in at the right time and say the right things to them. So that may have contributed to them resolving that trauma. For many people, they can't. They adapt, and they what they take on in themselves, they emotionally shut down. They might compartmentalize that trauma, but it always comes out in some way or another. What we have is children who experience trauma as a child. It actually affects the architecture of the brain. It actually impacts, like I said, it's trauma injury. So with developmental trauma, trauma that happens in a young child, you actually have a whole heap of things that actually affect the brain. So within the brain, trauma switches off certain circuitry. It floods the brain with the stress response, stress hormone, cortisol, which disintegrates the little bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain, making the left-hand side of the brain and the right-hand side of the brain, making it hard for them to talk to each other, so that you don't get a whole brain approach, which is a healthy approach. Children who've experienced trauma may be constantly scanning for danger because they've got an escalated fight-flight response happening. So they look, maybe sitting in class, they look like they're paying attention, and but inside their heads, they're wondering who's coming through the door, or they hear a door slam and they get escalated. And we might see aggression in the child. We might have a child that cries easily. We might have a child who has difficulty in language and academics because of the trauma to the brain, and which causes brain injury. And I know it's a long answer, but adults might experience the same. But if it's not a problem for them, it's not a problem for them. Like we talked about, they may have already had some pretty healthy coping mechanisms. But if not, a victim survivor, what we call victim survivor of trauma, may be emotionally shut off. Like I said, they might compartmentalise, they might be suspicious, they might be distrustful, they might be acutely sensitive to any negativity, they might struggle to be intimate. And one of the reasons for that is because we have these things, we have networks in our brain that are created through experience, and we have billions of them. So you might have a network called husband, and you might have a network called, let's label it as house, and you might have a network called chocolate. And when you have a new chocolate, that new information gets incorporated into that network, and that network means it's adaptive, so it can incorporate new information. And most of our networks inside our brain are like that. They are changing. As new information comes in, we adapt. Trauma networks are not like that. Trauma networks are rigid. Trauma networks are frozen in time. And so they're not adaptive, so new information can't come in. People get stuck in the trauma. And there's parts of the brain that actually timestamp the trauma when it happens. But or they should timestamp the trauma, but trauma actually shuts down that part of the brain, which is called the hippocampus. It shuts down or suppresses that, so that trauma doesn't get timestamped. So that memory, which should be a memory, may not feel like a memory. It may feel like it just happened yesterday. And that's the impact of trauma. It actually is very pervasive, and it actually can really interfere with so many parts of the brain, particularly for children at a time of crucial development, when they should be developing billions of networks that are adaptive. They're not.
They're not. Yeah. And I guess
a long answer.
I like that time stamping of an event, because, you know, like when you think of when it comes up again, or every time it comes up, if it's not time stamped, then all the emotions that you feel around it come flooding back as well. And that, you know, then having all those emotions and feelings, you know, not to have that time stamped, how you put it, it would be, you know, and to deal with it, you know, just whenever. You know, some situations aren't a good time to deal with all those emotions either, but constantly having to deal with it and not, you know, that's interesting.
And that's what trauma is. And you'll see that many of your viewers, or you've heard the expression PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the reasons that post-traumatic stress disorder is so pervasive, and you will have heard flashbacks and all those type of words, is because when the trauma happens, the hippocampus, that part of the brain that makes it a memory, is it's incorrectly stored, if you like. It's incorrectly filed in the brain, and it's not time stamped. So it feels like it's happening, it happened yesterday, or you're in it right now. And when that part of your brain fires up, your body responds.
Yeah.
And that fear circuitry is activated, and you've got there's 1,400 neurochemicals that flood your body with a traumatic incident. And that happens over and over and over again. So is it any wonder that people really struggle with these issues?
And their health, like having all that amount of cortisol constantly flowing through their bodies, like, you know, that's
adrenaline.
that's not a healthy response to have on board all the time. They're meant
That's exactly right.
help us in a fearful situation to get out of something, but not to constantly be in it is not healthy for any body part of our system. So,
that's right.
Like health-wise.
And a lot of those, and a lot of childhood trauma. I remember reading an article a couple of years ago. They were saying that there's a lot of, it was American research, and it was talking about a lot of experiences children have were actually misdiagnosed, and it was about, at the time it was conservatively about 30 million US children were actually experiencing PTSD.
It's terrible, isn't it?
Which is a lot.
And those children grow up to be adults who have issues, and is that our mental health suffers, in the population, and access to services, and
that's
brings
exactly
about the whole,
all those things.
There isn't enough funding for mental health and all those sorts of things, and how to access and all those things. So I guess, how do you go about getting help? Like, do I have to go and see if I'm having trouble coping, or my child is having difficulty coping? I guess I'm saying because I know our viewers are predominantly adult, but really we're sort of jumping between child and adult, because one of the questions I want to ask you very shortly is about emergency workers, etc. However, how do we go and get help? Like number one, I guess if we have a relationship with our GP, we should be talking to our GP.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And
so that would be first protocol.
Yeah, and then and then what would happen then?
So if you do have a relationship with a GP, then yes, they would be your first port of call. So you would go to them, you would explain maybe what you're experiencing. You may not be able to identify that it is your insomnia, your constant anxiety, your constant feelings of that something's wrong, those constant feelings of danger. You may not be able to connect that with a traumatic incident. You may just know that there's something not right, there's something going on. So you go to your GP, you would share what your symptoms are, and then they may offer you what's called a mental health care plan. And then you would go to that, and that would be a referral to a psychologist or a clinical psychologist or even a psychiatrist, and they would then and that's heavily subsidised. It can be like $180 for a psychologist, and you might get $80 back.
Yeah.
And so you're $100 out of pocket. But you could go there, and then they would start asking you questions. You would develop a therapeutic relationship with them, and then you would hope that during that time they would be able to identify what the source was, what actually was happening for you. Or alternatively, you might talk to a friend, and you may be aware of exactly what the trauma was, particularly if it's childhood abuse, or if you've experienced sexual assault or domestic violence. And you may seek out your own therapist. You may like the sound of a particular therapy. One of the therapies that I do occasionally is I actually live with a lot of horses, and I will do equine therapy. And that actually is very, very successful, particularly for people who don't really want to sit opposite a therapist and talk through stuff.
Yeah.
So it's experiential therapy. You're actually doing something, and there's people who do animal therapy. And anyway, so you can just ask people, look up any registering body that has counsellors, and usually you can click within those websites on what type of therapy you might be interested in, whether it's use, whether it's experiential, or look up what all these different types of therapies mean.
Yes.
There's a lot of information out there because there's a lot of therapies out there. So, yeah, word of mouth is always a really good way.
Yes, word of mouth is a good way of finding
Yes.
professional people, and people have had great success. You know, I was feeling like you know we know that in health, in seeking surgeons, say for bariatric surgery, a lot of it is word of mouth, and that's what my research showed, that you know it's people actually. Some would Google, but others would just know someone or bump into someone and use that very same surgeon. So word of mouth is your biggest, I guess, advertisement for
Yes.
being who you are and how good a job you do, you know. So that's true. So
Absolutely.
sorry, oh, I'm coming apart here.
Well,
So
just while that's happening, with trauma, though, there are very successful types of trauma treatment that many of us use. And so talk therapy, like I mentioned, exposure therapy is one where you slowly talk about what happened. Another one is a thing called EMDR, and that's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. I know that sounds very long, but it's not the fish slapping sort of therapy you'd expect it to be. It's really utilising the neurobiology of the brain, and it's been around for quite a while. And what that does is it takes that trauma, it pulls it out of that file, and it's done in a very careful, very safe environment over a period of time. But it pulls out that trauma, gets your brain to reprocess it, time stamps it, and then refiles it. So now that memory feels like a memory. It doesn't feel like it's happening then and there. And EMDR, movement desensitization reprocessing, that's one of the things that works. Group therapy also works. Somatic therapy, which is body work, that works as well. So there are some very good therapies out there. And it depends on the individual what they feel most comfortable with. And it's certainly worth exploring. There is help available, absolutely.
That's great to hear because, you know, post-traumatic stress or trauma is, you know, rampant, like, you know, and being able to deal with things and work through things so that you can, you know, have a good outlook and have relationships that last, or, you know,
absolutely.
A give and take. I guess I just want to probably look at, you know, like first line responses, like in professions like emergency workers, law enforcement, health professionals, doctors, nurses, dealing with situations that no one else really gets to deal with, and I guess they're repetitive situations as well. Often, you know, whether it's death or you know, a car accident or motor vehicle accident, that's, you know, where, you know, they've observed carnage and families. Yeah. So being able to work through things like, is there some way in our head that we can actually like mitigate or, you know, put things in place so that we stay healthy, like, and can stay healthy and not let those things sort of, I don't know, be prepared, because, you know, you're in that line of work. You know that these things, and you're going to experience them. So what can we do to make sure that we can process them healthfully, or, you know, have things in place where we can go and maybe talk? I don't know. What just some ideas from you.
Sure. And I think that is... there are things that we can do that prepare us for the work that we do. And one of the most important things, and your viewers will have heard this, is this concept of self-care. And if the job is very demanding and potentially traumatizing, which a lot of the jobs that you've mentioned are, then the need for self-care needs to be almost equal in time and effort. And I think one of the things we struggle with as people is giving ourselves permission to do that. We expect that we can just keep giving and giving and giving of ourselves and exposing ourselves to, and for some people, they're exposed to the most horrendous situations, the most horrendous stress and as you say, repetitive. And we need to remember that, and whilst we haven't really touched on it, the brain organises around repeated experiences, like when you play the guitar. When you first started, you're not very good at it. And the more you do it, your brain goes, yeah, I've got that, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do it better. And it organises around that experience. Well, the same goes for repeated exposure to trauma. Your brain will be escalated because that's a normal response when it sees trauma. And because it's constantly escalated, you actually reset the new normal. Your baseline is now much more elevated than what it used to. I hope that you can understand. That's understandable.
Yeah.
So the concept of self-care is really, really, really vital. You need to pursue a hobby that gives you pleasure, take long walks, listen to music, anything that's going to calm your system down. Good massage. The other thing is finding someone to debrief with. Get someone to rub your feet or something. Get someone to debrief with. Learning how to switch off, learning to separate work from home, and perhaps even developing a routine that if you're a police officer coming home from work, you actually do a little ritual or a routine. You might, as soon as you come through the front door, you might take off your whole uniform and you go somewhere, and then you put on the comfy clothes. You might have 15 minutes where it's just you by yourself, and you have a shower, and you put some music on, whatever it is, to create that difference, that you differentiate between the two. The other really important thing is you need to work for a supportive network. And many organisations, or some organisations, I should say, are still not quite there with giving good support for their workers and the time off, and funding even some good self-care. And they should do it because it actually will benefit their workers, and their workers won't burn out. However, let me say that it is not normal to witness constant trauma, constant grief, constant suffering, and that's going to impact anyone. We can mitigate, we can do things to help and increase the longevity in that job, but for some people it's going to be very tough.
Yeah. My husband previously was in law enforcement, and the experiences, and I know the experiences that the way that they were taught to actually deal with stress, and this is a number of years ago, and I don't think it has changed that much, is to go down to the pub with the boys and have a beer and chat about it then. However, police force is males and females. However, the effects of alcohol and being able to it's not the right message that we have for our emergency response workers. Anyone, self-medicate with alcohol. It's just not a good thing. You need to be talking to someone, not someone professional with strategies, not alcohol. So, otherwise you're going to end up with a problem and still have your trauma. And then have maybe an alcohol problem as well.
That's exactly right. That's right. And that just band-aids it. Your ability to recover from a traumatic incident, if it's a simple trauma, I think I touched on before, other factors will play a part. So you have people who are with those frontline responders, if they are coming into their jobs already with stuff, so already with poor childhood experience, adverse childhood experiences, a marriage breakdown or something like that, they're already primed. They're already primed for what they're witnessing to have a much more profound impact upon them. So it's very, 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 very important that we do things that are healthy for us. We eat well. The importance of sleep, which can be impacted by trauma. Having good supportive networks around us, surrounding us with people that actually bring love and joy into our lives instead of hypercritical people that are just going to pull you down and so on. All of these things will aid you in returning to health, because health and recovery is certainly possible. It just takes time and it takes good help. And that's what you should be seeking, not heading down the path, like you said, Sonia, just exchanging one problem for another.
Yeah. I guess wouldn't it be a great thing if if someone could share their issues or what they've experienced and be able to process it well, and then keep a person like a professional person, so as a backstop for when things do go wrong, or meet monthly or send off an email, or this has happened, can I see you, or because you may not have to see the person all the time, but just debriefing about a situation that was particularly upsetting or traumatic for you is a good way of setting things in place, and not self-medicating with sleeping tablets or because you can't sleep, and alcohol, because that's the way that we find it easier to talk about things often, but there is no resolution to that. So your problem's still there.
No, there's not. And I think perhaps one of the things that's probably worth mentioning is this concept of what we call vicarious trauma, which means you don't actually have to experience the trauma yourself. You can either hear about it or you can witness it, and you become traumatized through the story of someone else. And I remember reading an article a few years ago about, at the time, one of the most vicariously traumatized jobs was that of lawyers, because lawyers hear stories all the time. That's what they do. They hear stories, and obviously you would put into that first responders that are actually not only doing it themselves, but hearing what the experience of their colleagues are, and so on. So you don't actually have to witness or experience a trauma yourself. Just to have exposure to it can set your system off into that fear circuitry becomes activated, and off you go and experience trauma in your body as equal as if you were actually the victim yourself.
So it's important then that we share with people who have strategies and not with those who have, because otherwise, we can, cause trauma to them as well. So being able to talk to a professional person who can help us talk through things is more important. So
absolutely,
I guess some of the other things is like often mums and dads come home from work and share things around the family dinner table, or say, hey, what I saw today at work, da 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 da. So that does impact our children, and we need to be very. So you're saying that we need to be careful about doing and saying things.
We do, because what happens with that is a concept called safety chatter, and safety chatter can be what we might come home with a job. So if mum and dad are both ambulance officers or paramedics or doctors or police officers or something, the conversation that happens around the kitchen table, unless it's delivered in an age-appropriate way, I mean, there are some conversations we really shouldn't be having in front of children. And what we actually are doing is we're we're presenting to our children that the world is a very dangerous place. And we may then, because we're worried about what we're seeing, particularly with police officers and paramedics, we might say, don't do this, don't do that, be careful of this, be careful of that. Always sharing the message that the world is a dangerous place. And that's actually not true. The world it can be dangerous, of course, but we need to be careful about that type of repeated exposure for children, because children need to grow up in environments that they feel safe, that there's some sense of predictability with. And when and danger is unpredictable, and anxiety makes us feel very uncertain. So that safety chatter, we need to be very careful about how we hold those conversations. And as you said, Sonia, even though you might have a supportive partner, obviously you will talk to your partner about it, and for some people that has been a tremendous source of support, and that helps them through the worst periods of their job. But it is also good to have another safety net, a professional whose job it is to be there for you 100%, but actually to be able to put it into some sort of explain the psychological impact upon you, explain that you're not going crazy, and if you do feel like you're going crazy, what that means, because this is the way your brain's responding, and give you the strategies and the support you need. Yes.
Yeah, that's so important. So, with our social isolation currently happening right now,
yes,
you could say that there may be people feeling like they're experiencing a traumatic event.
Sure.
Because they have to be here and they have to do what they're told by the government.
Yeah.
I guess, how do we cope with that sort of in the background? I mean, we're all in it, and no matter if you're in Australia or in any other country currently, we're virtually all practicing similar, some are different, but similar isolation procedures or distancing or whatever. So we're all worldwide doing the same thing. Does that mean we're all going to have issues if we don't treat it and sort it in our heads well?
Well, I think one of the things, it's a very good question, and obviously this is the time that we're living in. No, but I think they're good questions. The thing is, we need to remember what the definition of trauma is. Trauma is something that overwhelms the brain. So, and sets off a whole heap of fear circuitry, something that escalates that. Well, for many of us, what we're talking about at the moment are things that make us feel uncomfortable. And it's unusual, and we're unsettled, and we're out of routine, and for people on their own, they may feel isolated. And if you're an extrovert, that can be really, really problematic. And potentially traumatizing. But for the majority of people, it's just going to be a pain. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be intrusive. It's going to be maybe scary because they're not sure what's going to happen. But that actually doesn't mean that it's going to be traumatic, because trauma overwhelms the brain. So for those in social isolation, there are some really important can do that's actually really, really helpful, and that brings a sense of security and predictability to your day. So what you can do is you work out a new routine, and you incorporate in that time for work, time to relax, time to shut down, time to connect with friends, which is really important. And there are so many platforms where you can do that at the moment. I was watching, I don't know if you've seen it, Sonia, if you've seen Couch Choir. And couch choir, it used to be called pub choir, so I'm not suggesting you head down to the pub, but what it is they used to do a thing called pub choir. It's now called couch choir, and what you do is you go online, you sign up, and you record you singing. You don't have to be able to sing 3 verses of a song, and I think they did Burt Bacharach's Close to Me, and you send it in and they stitch it all together. And you have like 1,000 people online in this choir singing, and it is brilliant. So there's this really awesome, lovely things happening out there. We need to avoid alcohol. Um, Alcohol, we're going to see a rise in domestic violence and abuse within the family homes because people are isolated, they all feel trapped, and that's where trauma will come into that. So we need to eat healthy. We need to take time to put together a really good routine for our children, incorporate some free play and all of that, and to remember that this actually time will end.
That's right.
We need to avoid this sense of permanence. It will come to an end, and wouldn't it be fantastic? Just wouldn't it be so good if we were able to, at the end, look back and go, "Oh my goodness, did we do so well during that time?"
Yeah.
So if people can work towards that, trying to bring their best selves to the situation, they will have the sense of achievement. When they look back, they can go, "Oh my goodness, that was a time of uncertainty for me. We didn't know what was going on. I didn't do too bad at that." And that actually increases a sense of self-worth. So that's all. I think there's some really good stuff that we could be doing at the moment.
So we can be putting a positive spin on the situation.
Yes.
And that's true. It's not like this is going to last forever. It's not going to last forever.
It's not.
Time. We're not sure exactly when that will be, but it will not be long lasting. So, and that is, it's like hope, isn't it? Hope gives you something to look forward to, and you know that it's not going to be like this forever. So, we organise ourselves and do what we have to do to keep ourselves healthy, both in physical and mind, and our families, and, do the best that we can. And then when we come out at the end, it's like, wow, good one.
That's right. And for people who have lost their job, they may say, well, that's all right for you to say because you haven't lost your job. But if I could just offer, this is a time when we are socially isolated, and there is a collective spirit in that, as you've mentioned. We are all in this together. But if I could just encourage people, as difficult it may be, and you may be angry, and you may be grieving, and you may be so frustrated with what has happened through no fault of your own, maybe take the time, if you can, to, instead of seeing it as a problem, see it as perhaps an opportunity in disguise. See it as, okay, I don't have a job now. I didn't really like that job too much anyway. What else could I do? What else could I do? Could I study something online? Could I go work in that animal shelter that I said I was going to do when I was a child? Or something like that. An opportunity to not see things as a problem, more of like, the world is not so much my oyster, but the world is opening up, and I can actually make some changes now. I've actually got the time. What changes could I make that might help me and my family?
No, that's a good point. There, here in Australia particularly, the social support, will help those who have financial issues, but in reality, we're all sharing the burden together, and we need to keep, what we're doing is the sharing, and we're doing it for everyone, and that's and that's part of our, I guess that's something that we can look at as well, that it just hasn't been like for me and my family or whatever. It's the greater good. The greater good is that we isolate and the COVID virus is done in a few months, done and dusted, and and we have the least possible amount of deaths, I guess, that we can possibly have, because we've faced the things that have been described to us by our government and enforced to a certain degree. However, it is for everyone. It's not just for one person. It's not just for, it's not just for the wealthy. It's not just for, this. It is for everyone, old, young.
That's exactly right.
Those who are wealthy, those who are poor. What is poor? you know, Australia is pretty, you know, we have it pretty good, really.
That's right.
So, yeah, so having the opportunity to do things, I guess, that, you know, they haven't been able to do, and all those things that you've said. So, you know, looking at looking at, I guess, the people and the trauma that you see and the things that you discuss with clients, probably over and over, um, I guess, what would be three things that you could have, if there were three things that you could advise, what would they be? Like in relation to
Sure.
what, you know, what you see and how, you know, you see it a lot and you think, oh, if only I could just say this, or if only people could understand that this isn't what they think it is, or, you know, like, because, you know,
Yeah.
often with mental health, you know, we don't understand it very well. And often we put labels on people and labels on,
Sure.
so yeah.
Okay, so there are probably many that you
Yeah.
could, but probably in the context of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I would say, and I'll say to your viewers, that if you've experienced childhood trauma, it's not your fault. You didn't do it. Whatever you've experienced, that responsibility for that lies at the feet of those who did what they may have done to you, or the environment you grew up in. You were a child. It is never, ever the child's fault, ever. And when people have experienced childhood trauma, they carry, like I said, those feelings of guilt and shame. And it's really hard for people to hear that. So that is one thing that I would say very, very passionately to people. It is
Yeah.
not your fault. The other thing that I would say is you are worth every cent and every moment that it takes to make you feel better. You should try and think about yourself in that way, that you are worth it. And that when you do better, your children will do better, the people around you will do better. But if you're struggling, you need to take the time, you need to put the resources into making yourself whole again. And it's possible. It really, really is possible. And leading into that is just get really good professional help, no matter what that looks like. It actually takes time to rewire your brain, like I was talking about, to reprocess that trauma, to pull out that file. And I'm not trying to diminish the trauma by calling it a file. I'm actually talking about neural networks. But it takes time to activate that neural network, to reprocess it, and then to file it away. So, and it takes the sting out of it, which is what we want, so that it is no longer overwhelming or affecting your life. So find a good therapist and start the journey because you're worth it.
Well, thank you so much, Judy, for being on my channel and sharing and discussing trauma with us today, both in children and adults. It's been so helpful. And so I really want to thank you for being with us. And
Pleasure.
And what I'll do is I'll include some links in the description box where you can go and find help or resources for help or mental health, you know, all those sorts of things, so that you can read, you can contact someone if you need to talk to someone, all those things. So they'll be in the description box below and you'll be able to access those. And of course, if you know someone who's struggling right now, you know, you might want to share this video clip and or tell them to have a look at it as well. So thank you very much, Judy, and thank you all my subscribers and viewers, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.